Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And I'm joined tonight by my good friend, Dee Pierce, host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. How are you,
Yeah,
Dee?
I'm doing good. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much.
Happy to be joining the show.
I'm happy to be here, too.
And right now I'm sharing. I'm over on X sharing, and then I'll be over on Facebook and share.
Okay, I'll be sharing in just a minute, but I want to let you folks know that we've got four good videos tonight to tear apart. So that's going to be lots of fun, we hope. They're pretty important videos. In one, Colonel Danny Davis is interviewing uh, one of his favorite people, Colonel McGregor. In the second one, in the second video, Chris Hedges is doing an interview of Alistair Crook. And that's just a brilliant interview. I'm not sure that Chris himself was asking such questions that were so penetrating, but all he had to do was ask anything, and then Crook just flooded everything with facts. So that's a particularly good one. And then there were two videos, involving Pepe Escobar, the world's most wonderful journalist. In the first video, he and Danny Haifong are cutting a rug, as it were. And that video was done before the BRICs meeting. And then there's a video between the judge and Pepe Escobar, which was cut after the BRICS meeting in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil. So it's interesting to see the contrasting perspectives on the meeting between before the meeting and after the meeting. Things change considerably, and it's interesting to contemplate that. I think. So I'll be ready to start in just a minute, but
It's important to share.
I do want to share because, as Dee says, it's very important to share. Dee's been doing a lot of sharing already, but this is my first opportunity to do any.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I see Steve Wolfbrandt is here and Dawn Foster is here. Hello.
Good.
Hello, everybody.
For some reason, my share is not working, so I'll try it again. See if it works better this time. Maybe I need to refresh my Facebook.
Maybe.
I'm pretty sure my connection to the internet is solid. Yeah. That seems to be solid. So once more, yes. Now everything is copacetic. So that was all I had to do. Okay, so we have two topics for tonight. One is more about the Iran war, and exactly what happened there. And the other topic is beginning the war on BRICs. That is, evidently the collective West is now in earnest with respect to trying to do negative things to BRICs. So we'll be talking about that as well. And to the extent it's possible, we'll try for both of us to interrupt each other and the video as we go through each one. So I'll share the screen for the first of our videos. That's a continuation of a video we covered last time on Tuesday.
Okay.
And the two participants were Colonel Davis and also Colonel McGregor, Douglas McGregor, and Danny Davis. And there they are. And we'll pick up the video at roughly 34:07 in.
They have uniparties. In other words, if you're not any alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, then
if you don't know what this is what's called a gimbal. It keeps your phone nice and steady no matter where you put it on screen, allowing you.
you're in the uniparty. And the uniparty is keeping the AfD out of power. The uniparty is going to keep every nationalist in Europe out of power because nationalism is bound up with national identity, culture, religion, way of life. Nationalism is the enemy that they cannot ultimately defeat, but they're going to try to do so by focusing everyone on this phony external enemy called Russia.
Now, just a little comment here. It used to be the case back in the post-war period that people would make a distinction when they were talking about love of country. And the distinction was nationalism was the bad kind of love of country because it excluded or somehow downgraded other countries. But patriotism was supposed to be the good kind, of love of country. Well, the thing I find interesting, these days is that people no longer seem to make that particular decision. I think that's kind of significant because it used to be okay for Americans to exhibit their patriotism all over the place. But we were never supposed to exhibit nationalism all over the place because nationalism was associated with countries that were fascist, or that were Nazi. In other words, nationalism was a more extreme form of patriotism, in the older usage. Today, people no longer seem to make that particular distinction. Colonel McGregor here certainly is not making that distinction, and he's using nationalism as a term with connotations that are very favorable. So let's go on.
And again, why are they so opposed to Russia? Because Russia is a national Russian state that rests on a foundation of Orthodox Christianity.
I usually have to get an extension cord, but now I can just take this with me wherever I go.
And it has been successful at integrating Muslims into its society in an effective and positive way, to the point now where your Muslim population of 20 million inside Russia's 140 plus million is no less nationalistic and supportive of the Russian state than the Orthodox Christians. The point is they're going to lose. Ruta is doomed. All of these people in Western Europe that are in this government are doomed. Unfortunately, they're going to continue to run these economies into the ground. Donald Trump is running us into the ground because they've all done what Donald Trump has done, thrown fiscal discipline overboard. It doesn't.
Uh-oh. So Doug here is appealing to fiscal discipline, okay, as a favorable thing to do. What does he mean by fiscal discipline? He doesn't really say. He never really defines it. But as we go through the video, it's apparent that what he means is that a country ought not to run up its debt, meaning what he seems to be concerned is the excessive selling of debt instruments, so that people have a lot of outstanding debt instruments that are yet to be still outstanding. So that's a simple idea of fiscal discipline. If pressed, he would probably say that what he means is that the debt to GDP ratio should be low, and that it's a worrisome thing for it to be high. But that's about as explicit as he seems to get. But one thing he's doing, and that's very important for us to note, is to advocate for fiscal discipline, meaning a debt to GDP ratio that is not too excessive, or a debt that is not too excessive. Undoubtedly, he would consider the debt to GDP ratio of the Japanese government, which is somewhere around 270% at this point, is excessive. He would probably consider the debt to GDP ratio of the United States government as excessive. And he would probably be insisting that we're not showing any fiscal discipline, or that can be inferred from the context of how he talks about fiscal discipline. We'll go forward now with the rest of the video.
Matter. We can spend as much as we want on the military, and we can still maintain everything that we have, our standard of living, the access to the high-end goods, access to all the food we want. And Dan, I don't think that's true. I think we're...
Well, why wouldn't it be true? Certain countries, are monetary sovereigns. For the sake of this discussion, let's just say that a monetary sovereign is a country that's able to create its own money, at will. Okay, that floats, that allows its currency to float on international exchanges, to freely float. It doesn't try to maintain a fixed exchange rate compared to other countries or some standard, such as a gold standard. Okay, and the third criterion for monetary sovereignty, is that the country should not owe any debts in a currency that they're not able to create. So those are the three criteria. Sometimes a fourth is added, which is to say that the country has to tax, in its own currency, and not, in any other currency. So those are four criteria that mark a monetary sovereign. The question I want to raise here is, what is to prevent a monetary sovereign from spending as much as it wants to spend uh, um, uh, on anything that can be bought with its own particular currency. In other words, as long as anything is for sale, in its currency, then what limit or constraint is there on spending for, such a monetary sovereign? Well, you might say one constraint on spending, is inflation, an inflation constraint. And you'd be right in suggesting that too much spending is when your deficits are so high that it brings you, inflation of the currency. Well, why is that bad? Okay, because when the currency, when prices are inflated, the currency, is devalued over a period of time. And that can have a bad effect on the legitimacy of the currency and eventually on the legitimacy of the government. And that can be a bad effect. So one constraint on spending is, certainly the inflation constraint. But here's the question. Is there a constraint based on the idea of fiscal sustainability? If a country is a monetary sovereign, and here are some examples of monetary sovereigns. The United States is a monetary sovereign. Australia is a monetary sovereign. The UK is a monetary sovereign. Canada is a monetary sovereign. Also, Japan is a monetary sovereign. Have I said Australia? I think I did say Australia. Also, New Zealand is a monetary sovereign. So these are examples, of monetary sovereigns, current examples of monetary sovereigns. What if I told you, or what if I suggested, what if I asked, the questions, do monetary sovereigns have any fiscal sustainability problems? That is to say, can they have larger and larger and larger deficits and still be fiscally sustainable? And the answer to that question, is yes. But based on what Colonel McGregor is saying here, he doesn't seem to believe that. He seems to believe that for monetary sovereigns such as the United States, there can be fiscal sustainability problems. He seems to believe it because he thinks that when those countries have deficits, or run deficits, and the deficits get extremely large, then the interest on those deficits is going to get extremely large. And then the countries involved won't be able to afford the heavy interest burdens that they have. But the question is, why won't they be able to afford that? Why are the interest payments any burden for them at all, since we've already established that they're free to create as much money as they need to create to pay any bill that they need to pay, or to buy anything for sale, in their currency, in their own currency. So why is there a problem if they have extremely high debts? So that's something I want you to keep in mind as we go through this.
Looking at a kind of structural inflation that we're not prepared for. We talk about the debasement of the currency, but the bigger issue is the dollar. And as the dollar diminishes in terms as a store of value, and people turn increasingly to gold, What does that mean for dollar-denominated wealth anywhere?
Okay, if people turn increasingly to gold, okay, in the sense that they give their dollars away to other people in return for gold, and they buy a lot of gold, undoubtedly the value of gold is going to go up because the demand for gold is going to be heavier. But there's a problem with gold. And the problem with gold is that the supply of gold is limited. So you can only buy so much gold. So the value of gold is going to get inflated because there's too little supply and everybody wants to buy gold. Furthermore, gold has certain other limitations. In countries like the United States and in most countries of the world at this point, you cannot pay your taxes in gold because the taxes are due in fiat currencies, and that is all that is accepted in payment, okay, of taxes. So, okay, if you've invested in gold, okay, as a store, okay, of value, you always have to be able to sell the gold for fiat currency. So the paradox here is if fiat currency becomes scarce because too many people are selling their currency and are buying gold instead or other commodities instead, then perhaps we'd be facing a liquidity crisis. But on the other hand, for a monetary sovereign, it's very easy for the central bank to avoid a liquidity crisis. All it has to do, okay, is issue more money and swap that money for commodities of various kinds, including gold, but also debt instruments, okay, and other things. That process, okay, is a quantitative easing process, is what it's called, but it can stop any liquidity crisis. So I have to come back to the question: why is it a problem if people are going to start to turn to gold? I mean, the only problem I see is that it's going to drive up the price of gold. But I mean, I don't see a problem with that unless you want to buy gold. But if you don't want to buy gold and are content to hold your fiat currency, there's no problem. Also, the more you turn to gold, you have a problem, and that problem is how are you going to buy things, since most people are selling things in return for fiat currency and not in return for gold. Well, these are small problems, right?
Whether it's in Europe or the United States, remember we have the euro dollar, and Europe holds vast quantities of euro dollars. That's why when we go down financially, which is coming, they will go down with us. When that happens, all bets are off.
What happens if we don't go down financially? Specifically, what does it mean for us to go down financially? What exactly is Douglas talking about? Well, he probably means if we have a depression, okay, or if we have a recession. But if we have a recession, or if we have a depression, then it's possible for our government to pursue aggressive fiscal policies that will keep up the level of employment and end a recession, or end a depression. In fact, it is always possible for a government that's a monetary sovereign to pass fiscal policies that will provide for full employment. All you have to do is pass a job guarantee program at a living wage that's socially inclusive. Now, we don't have such a program here in the United States, but we could have it. And that would put an end to unemployment. And if the wage were at a socially inclusive living wage, then people would be comfortable on that wage, however many people were on the job guarantee program. So what does he mean by the United States going down? I mean, he's not very explicit about that. He's not very detailed about that.
Well,
Right.
let me ask you for something.
Desperate attempt. That's all this is, to stay in power.
And what if it's more than that? So I have no way to independently validate this, but I have heard a growing suspicion among some that, especially when you look at how we have just literally jettisoned any kind of fiscal discipline in terms of national debt. In fact, let's use a steam shovel to actually make it bigger. And this bill, by everyone's account, certainly does that. Europe is now the only way that they can jump to 5% is through more debt. Is that the allegation is that they meaning some unknown elites in the West writ large, actually want an actual conflict conventionally. They don't want it to go nuclear, but they do want a war with Russia, because then that would like almost wipe the slates clean, because then you would have to go into this, then you could default and whatever, and you could fight this, and then maybe on the other end of it, come out on top and just wipe all this debt out. Do you put it?
Okay, so what Danny is saying is that one option when you have high debt, okay, and you want to get rid of a national debt that's too high, is that you have a war with someone, okay, and you win that war, okay, and then you erase your debt. So maybe you lose that war and you default on your debts. Well, there are historical examples of that. In the Second World War, when Japan was losing the war, it defaulted on its debts. It wouldn't pay its debts to people. Okay, and eventually it got away with that. Okay, because after the war, we wanted to incorporate a Japan that would be a valuable ally into our coalition. And so we allowed them to default on their debts. Okay, but it's relevant to ask the question here. Okay, let's say the United States got into a war with some other country. Okay, and we won the war. Why would that mean that we could default on our debts? In other words, let's go back to the example of World War II. We came out of World War II with extremely high debts. Now, we didn't do anything to default on our debts. I mean, what we did is, at the end of the war, we had an economic boom because of all the demand, that was pent up because people bought debt instruments, raising the debt of the government extremely high, but creating demand that was pent up because after the war they could sell the debt instruments. That would give them cash to spend on various things, and the economy boomed. And as GDP expanded, then the ratio of debt to GDP went down. That's how we got out of the high debt to GDP situation at the end of the Second World War. We expanded our GDP because we won the war. We did nothing to repudiate our debts, though. So why would anybody think that having a war now is going to allow us, to repudiate our debts? But anyway, that's one option for getting rid of your national debt that is being entertained by some people. As Danny Davis tells us, there are some people who think we can somehow get rid of our debts by having a war and winning a war. Let's go on.
Any credibility to that possibility?
When you have these woke revolutions, it requires all of us at some point to say, no, I'm not going to do this.
No, I think the notion that war is going to rescue from your fiscal emergency is delusional and dangerous.
Right, but do people think that? That's the
You
question.
know, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it has more to do with what I said. Create the illusion of the threat to justify the spending, to justify the mobilization, to justify the surveillance state and the application of more laws that suppress free speech. Those
I think Doug is very correct about that. That's a pattern that we're certainly beginning to see. Okay, but that doesn't really say anything about our options for getting rid of high levels of debt, that we don't like. We'll go over those options in just a minute some more.
are the things that are important to the globalist elites. You know,
But so even from their perspective, though, because it would almost seem illogical to go down that path, because by swamping even more debt on there, this is not going to eliminate the debt. It's just going to keep it stacking up. And at some point, I mean, even by a globalist assessment, that's going to come down. How do they deal with that as far as you know?
well, I think they're kicking that can down the road, just as Donald Trump has. I mean, if you listen to his Secretary of the Treasury, Bessent, he has a scheme that has been employed in the past in the developing world to use Treasury bills, to go into the Treasury and use that as an artificial form of the Federal Reserve, and to effectively cope with debt in that manner. I mean, that deserves an hour of discussion on its own.
So it's too bad we didn't have this discussion here, because I don't know what Doug means, by Treasury bills. But now I'm ready to talk about some options, okay, for dealing with debts. So option one is to have a war. But as we've already discussed, I don't know that really gets rid of the debt. Option two, let's see, maybe D has gone out for a while and come in again. I just heard a sound. Yeah, D. Oh, you dropped out for a while.
Yeah, I got kicked out for a while. Somehow it just dropped out.
No, okay. I don't think I kicked you out.
No, you didn't.
Okay, good, because I didn't intend to. So, okay, so back to the stream that we've been viewing. Okay, so option one, again, is the option of having a war to get rid of your debt. I suppose that might work if you lose the war and you default on your debts. So the winners, can't be paid your debts. On the other hand, that might not be too good for you, okay, if you, had a different creditor than the United States at the end of the Second World War. I mean, it worked well for the Japanese, but it might not work well as a general method. Now, if you're a monetary sovereign, though, okay, and if you're the United States, then you can certainly do two things very easily.
Yes.
The first thing that you can do is you can mint a 1 ounce, platinum coin. Have the executive branch do that. There is a coin law which allows the executive the power to do that. And you can put an arbitrary face value on that particular coin. Let's say the face value you choose is $100 trillion. Okay, then the debt currently sits at, 36.5 trillion, now starting to get up to 37 trillion. Well, if you've minted a $100 trillion coin and you've deposited it at the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve credits you with additional reserves, that brings your bank account up to over $100 trillion. That is the Treasury General account, to over $100 trillion. Then guess what? You have enough money to pay off the debt as it falls due over 30 years. It wouldn't be good for you to pay it off all at once, but you want to pay it off when it falls due. If you paid it off all at once, it would inject too much money into the economy, too much liquidity into the economy, and that might cause a lot of inflation. But if you wait until the debt falls due, then all you're doing is replacing the security with an equivalent amount of cash. And that is not, an inflationary thing to do. So you could pay down the debt over 30 years. Since most debt is actually fairly short term, a very high percentage of the debt, I haven't checked exactly, but it's maybe 90% of the debt would be paid off within 3 years. And the rest, would pay off the long-term debt instruments, like the 10 and 20 and 30-year debt instruments, okay, that are out there. And you'd pay them off over 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years. Okay, but the public would immediately see at the end of 3 years that you would pay down 90% of the debt, and they would no longer consider debt to be a problem, because it wouldn't be at 37 trillion anymore. It would only be at 3.7 trillion. So that would be a way of a monetary sovereign like the United States, getting rid of its debt problem. Now, here's a second thing that the United States could do to get rid of its debt problem. Okay, if people consider it, to be a debt problem. Second thing that we could do is Congress, when it passes a money bill, could always provide for the period of that particular money bill. If it's a 1-year bill, a 2-year bill, a 3-year bill, but say it's a 1-year bill. So you provide language, doesn't take much, only 2 sentences, inside of that bill, that aside from the appropriation of money, one sentence orders the Federal Reserve to put reserves into the Treasury spending account necessary to spend the appropriation of Congress. In other words, to immediately place that amount of money in the Treasury spending account. And the second sentence would direct the Federal Reserve to add to reserves in the amount of the value of the principal of all the debt instruments that were due over the period of a year, plus all the interest payments that were due over the period of a year, as well. So on the point of passage of such a bill, the appropriation in the bill is overtly financed by getting the Federal Reserve, by mandating the Federal Reserve to immediately come up with the money for the Treasury spending account, to pay for the spending, to pay back the debts, and to pay for the interest due. That would again mean over a period of 30 years, there would be no more debts, and no more interest due. And of course, at the end of 3 years, 90% of the debt would also be gone. So that's the second thing you could do. The first thing uses the power of the executive branch. The second thing uses the power of the legislature. But in both those instances, it would become apparent to the public immediately that there was no debt problem. Now, you might use one of these two methods. It seems to me either of them is a better option than going to war and trying to cancel the debt somehow at the end of the war. I think these are better options. But of course, these are all options to be considered, by the decision makers. Okay, but there's also a third option, and the third option is actually is the simplest option, but it has one fault, which I'll mention in just a minute. The third option is to get rid of the debt ceiling law we have here in the United States, so Congress can, simply keep on issuing and selling debt instruments. So then the money would keep flowing. All the previous debts would be paid off, as they fall due. Of course, we would have an increasing debt over time, but maybe people would come to realize, that all the debt that's out there, the federal government, represents the net financial assets of the non-government sector that have been created over a period of time. So let's say the debt, let's take a look at the $37 trillion or so debt we have now. People are holding that debt. That debt is the debt of the government, but it's net financial assets of those who are holding the debt instruments. Those net financial assets turn into cash when the debt falls due, because the government will always have money to pay it back, as long as we assume that those debt instruments will always have a market. Now, of late, some people have become very afraid that because people are losing confidence in the dollar, that we're going to get some auctions in selling the debt where the debt's not going to be sold out. And so people are worried about that. They're worried that the market for U.S. debt, is going to dry up. Well, there's a very, very easy solution for that. In other words, that's a fourth option now for getting rid of the debt. But then someone will say, well, the fourth option won't work because people will get tired of buying the debt, after a period of time. Well, let's say that happens. Then what do we do to stop that? Well, if we're interested in issuing debt, issuing more debt because, we have other reasons, we want to issue the debt other than just getting money or having sustainability. If that's the case for us, and we want to be able to continue to sell the debt, then we can use the two other options, the overt congressional financing option or the platinum coin option. We can use those to pay off, a part of the debt. The effect of that over a period of time is going to be that there will be less debt instruments in the market, for U.S. debt. And what happens when there are less debt instruments, that are available? Because we're no longer issuing debt because we're paying it off with platinum coins or paying it off with overt congressional financing. Well, then what happens is the debt gets to be more valuable. In other words, there's less and less supply of debt compared to demand. So over a period of time, the demand for U.S. debt is going to come back again. Now, I don't know what the level of platinum coins or overt congressional financing has to be done to make the market for debt actually come back. But I assume it's not going to be a lot. I'm sure by the time we've paid off 50% of the debt, the market to buy U.S. debt instruments will be back because people will want to buy a debt instrument that has a guaranteed payment attached to it and then also pay some interest. In other words, that's always been why people want to buy U.S. debt. And if that debt is becoming, less attractive to buy now, then the remedy for that is to make the debt more scarce, which you could do by using the other two methods to pay off the debt. So, what I'm trying to say here is that we're not entering an uncontrolled situation. From Doug McGregor's point of view and Danny Davis' point of view, they see the level of debt going up, up, and up.
Now, Joe,
Yes, Steve.
what I was going to say is the focus isn't on the public economy.
Absolutely. They're not considering the public economy at all. All they're doing is considering the debt and saying, oh, the burden of this debt is going to be increasingly heavy and we won't be able to afford it because they're tacitly assuming that it's not fiscally sustainable. But I just showed you that whatever debt we have is fiscally sustainable because we're always going to be able to pay it off, either through overt congressional financing or through the use of platinum coins.
And like they say, one person's red ink and somebody else is black ink.
One person's red ink, in other words, the government's red ink is the black ink of the non-government sector. As I said before, the debt of the government, which by the way is not the people's debt, it's the government's debt. The government's debt, if you look at the other side of the balance sheet, is the net financial assets of the non-government sector. So the $37 trillion in debt represents $37 trillion worth of assets that lie in the non-government sector. The owners of the government debt have that $37 trillion worth of assets. That's very important, for people to understand. Okay, so it's obvious that neither Dan Davis nor Doug McGregor really have considered or taken into account the capability of the government to, simply create money, though maybe that's what Douglas means, by issuing treasury bills. Maybe he has in mind the issuance in certain countries of money. Now, of course, he says he wants another hour to discuss that. I'm sure if he took another hour to discuss it, what he'd be talking about in the other hour is, well, when you print money, you're going to have too much money and you're going to get inflation, which means that he'd be carrying the argument, to the next level. And he'd be saying, well, the problem isn't really fiscal sustainability because the government, if it's a monetary sovereign, can always create the money it needs to pay anything. So the problem is not fiscal sustainability. The real problem is inflation. I'm anticipating what Douglas would probably contend. So the problem then becomes when we're paying off the debt, how do we control the inflation that may come about as a result of paying off the debt? Well, I've already pointed out that if you pay off the debt as it falls due, that won't be inflationary. If you don't pay it off too fast, it's not going to be inflationary because it's just an exchange of one financial asset, specifically the government bond, for another financial asset, bank reserves or cash. So that's all you're dealing with there. So that's not going to be inflationary part of it. Where inflation might occur is where the government spends, where the deficit spending of the government is done on the wrong things. If the spending is done on the wrong things,
Mm-hmm.
or if the deficit spending is too high, and too high, okay, is a relative term. For example, if you spend on the right things, okay, that are not, in, uh, inherently inflationary, you may be able to spend a lot more on those things without running into the inflation problem. But if you spend on the wrong things, then you might run into the inflation problem far sooner. But whether you spend on the right things or you spend on the wrong things, there are ways to contain inflation that we've used in the past that we know work. In World War II, we found that selling debt instruments helped to contain the tendencies towards inflation, in the Second World War. Now, we had a lot of tendencies towards inflation there because we took the private economy of the government, and we put that, okay, to the war effort so that there was a shortage of consumer goods. But everybody was working, so there was lots of money around. So one of the things we did to contain inflation was to sell debt. And the debt absorbed the excess money because it was turned into a net financial assets in the form of bonds. And that helped us to contain the inflation in the Second World War. Something else we did in the Second World War that people don't like, but it works to contain inflation. That is, we had wage and price controls in the Second World War, and they were tight. And if you violated the wage and price controls, you went to jail. That's why they worked, because they were harsh, okay, and definite. They were called for effort. So we had very little inflation, even though we had very low rates of unemployment. Our unemployment during the Second World War was running at 1%. And yet we had almost no inflation during the war, or at least very low rates of inflation compared to what we were expecting. So there are ways of controlling inflation. Also, regulations can help to control inflation. So the point is, if inflation's the problem, you can control it. If you want to pay off the debt because you find it, to be politically annoying, you can pay it off. That by itself is not going to be a cause of inflation. If you deficit spend on the wrong things, that can be a cause of inflation. But that part is a discussion for another day. All I'm trying to point out here is that the level of debt and the debt to GDP ratio is not in itself a problem. A monetary sovereign such as the United States can handle that. All the other monetary sovereigns can handle that, okay, as well. But since their financing is not as convoluted as our financing, most of those countries can simply decide to issue money when they want to issue it, without actually issuing any debt to correspond to the money issued. It's even easier for them to handle their debt problems than we have. But while we're talking about ease of handling debt problems, we have to talk about something else, which is very relevant to what the two colonels are talking about here. specifically, the heavy majority of NATO countries are, okay, in Europe, and they're members of the Eurozone. And those countries cannot issue their own currency. They aren't monetary sovereigns anymore. They gave up their monetary sovereignty to the European Central Bank, which issues the euro. And that means that the budgets of euro countries are not fiscally sustainable. And not only that, there are euro rules that restrict their deficit spending to 3%. So they have austerity that is built in, which is about to create a great problem for them, because they now, at the request of the United States, at the orders from the United States, they want to increase their spending from roughly their military spending from 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP. They can't do that without cutting their social safety nets. And if they try to cut their social safety nets, what's going to happen is these governments are going to fall. And maybe countries are going to start leaving the Eurozone. And maybe NATO will fall apart also. But it's very dangerous to try to get these countries of Europe to increase their military spending from 2% to 5%. And not only is it dangerous, but it's stupid, because the increase in that spending is for the purpose of countering the Russians, who do not plan any large military efforts in Europe as soon as they wind up the effort in Ukraine. In fact, we already know that their budgets are going to be scaled down for next year, assuming, of course, that they wind up the Ukraine effort. On the other hand, our NATO countries are now talking about increasing the spending to 5% and keeping the Ukraine war going. And if they do that, that's going to continue to produce a very dangerous situation, okay, inside of Europe. Of course, I don't know if they'll be able to keep on spending on the war, because the Russians just might wind up the war over the next 2 months before they can get a lot of new equipment into Ukraine. Also, moreover, Ukraine has already, according to Doug McGregor, in the earlier part of this video, he estimates the military fatalities in Ukraine have been 1.7 million thus far. How much more in military fatalities can Ukraine sustain? Reports are they're already down to teenage people. They're drafting teenage people now. Anyway, the whole thing is ridiculous. I'm ready to go on with the video at this point.
This is what they call a strategy for financial dominance. I personally think that they're delusional and dangerous. I don't see that working at all. I see no alternative at some point to default. And the lesson of history is it's better to default early than later. One of the things that nobody ever brings up is that we defaulted twice in the 30s under FDR, but we called it restructuring our debt. In 34 and 36, we couldn't pay. And the creditors said, that's all right, we'll restructure this. Now, why did they say that? Well, they knew that eventually we would recover come hell or high water. We had the largest skilled labor force in the world. We had the world's largest, most robust manufacturing base in the world. What do we have now? Neither. So who is going to deal with us? Who's going to help us? Who's going to willingly restructure things? Nobody.
Well, once again, we don't need people to restructure things, because we could simply make all of our debt payments by issuing platinum coins, or Congress having the Federal Reserve, issue the reserves, necessary to pay off all our debts as they fall due. And as long as we continue to pay off our debts as they fall due, we won't be defaulting, and the creditors won't be complaining.
Plus the fact, if you look at President Trump and what he's just done in Iran, and you're a Korean or a Japanese or Chinese, and remember that part of the world, Vietnamese, all of these people share one thing in common. Well, more than one thing, but one thing in particular, the desire for stability and order. They want predictability because they see stability and order as a precondition for prosperity.
Nerve pain, do not take gabapentin. Did you know that neuropathy symptoms are completely reversible? Let me.
And that's their focus. Their focus, contrary to popular belief, is not on building as many nuclear warheads as they can to destroy us.
Right.
That's crap. Okay. It's just nonsense. So that's where they're interested in. Why did the Koreans and the Japanese refuse to attend the NATO summit? They just said, we're not coming. We're not coming for reasons to do with what has just happened in Iran. And there was some other jargon in there, but the bottom line is they think we're crazy. They see Donald Trump as this dangerous, unbalanced individual who is governing our country. Now,
Of course, they're right.
in MAGA world, he's wonderful. Oh, everybody loves him. He's great. They think.
No, they no longer love him anymore. Because, as you know, they're very upset over the Epstein files and the fact that he seems to be hiding information from them in the Epstein files. So they're really upset over that. And they're upset over the tariffs, too. And they're upset over the big, beautiful bill that was just passed, which is going to take away their Medicaid and SNAP money. Too bad.
These expressions of extreme hubris are funny or entertaining or amusing. That's not the way the rest of the world looks at it. And
Well, in
remember,
fact, speaking of that, let's take a look at what's happening later today. There's going to be a meeting talking about MAGA world and Trump and making everything in front of people. Netanyahu is coming to the White House, and there's a lot of things on his agenda there. How do you see that plan, especially in terms of things you just talked about with the Azerbaijan situation, with Russia there, with Iran? I mean, a lot of things are on the plate today. What do you expect is going to happen behind closed doors?
well, remember that 17 members of the Israeli Knesset are coming with President or Prime Minister Netanyahu. And their job is to lobby people on the Hill and in industry to support what Netanyahu wants. What does Netanyahu want? He wants the final solution for Gaza. Let's not lose sight of that. The most recent polling done by Hebrew University in Israel says that 81% of the population supports effectively genocide in Gaza. He wants to annex the West Bank. These are the things that he wants. Are we going to stop supporting him because we are uncomfortable with the mass murder and expulsion program in Gaza? Are we going to stop supporting him because we're not comfortable with another million plus Palestinians being driven away from their homes and pushed into somebody else's country? I don't think so. So I'm
Okay, I don't think so either. But if the United States and Israel try to attack the Iranians again, and they get a mouthful of missiles, okay, in return, and even further damage to the economy, okay, of Israel, and also extensive damage to our bases in the Middle East, then they might think it's time to settle with Iran and settle with the Houthis and settle with Hezbollah and settle with all the other actors in the Middle East who are not in favor of the Abraham Accords solution to the problem. We here in the United States may decide the whole thing is too costly, and we may want to settle for peace. And if we do want to settle for peace, we're not going to get it unless the Palestinians get a state. So that's the kind of thing that can get us away from continuing to support, the genocide in Gaza. Okay, Dee, you want to add anything here?
What was I gonna say? I was just here talking with the dogs. What was that you said?
Okay, what I said is that Doug may be right that on their own, the people of the United States are not going to object, to continuing the genocide in Gaza. Okay, but if there are further attacks by the Israelis, and or the United States on the Iranians, and they reply in kind, then, the devastation caused by those attacks may cause the United States and the Israelis to seek a settlement. And they're not going to get a settlement, without ending the war in Gaza.
That's true.
And without the Palestinians getting a state of their own.
That's 100% true.
Yes. So anyway, that's what I said. I might have said it in a more roundabout way, but that is what I said.
Right, and that's what they've been saying all along.
Yeah.
I mean, the region's been saying that, the Palestinian state, and now you have more people talking about this greater Israel.
Right, and that is even more unacceptable to people than the other things they were talking about.
And the anger towards Egypt and Jordan for not doing anything, that basically when they talk about greater Israel, they said, you deal with it on your own, Israel, deal with it on your own, Jordan. You did nothing for the Palestinians. Why should anybody worry about you?
Yes. And of course, if they go after greater Israel, then that's going to involve some loss of Egyptian territory. And it's going to involve the end of Jordan.
Yeah.
Entirely. It's not going to involve the end of Egypt, but it'll involve the end of Jordan.
Exactly. And we know the wealthiest, they'll fly out, they'll leave.
Yeah, the king of Jordan will leave and go to London, where he prefers to live anyway. He will escape with his loot and probably
That's basically it.
Be happy for the rest of his life. Anyway, going on with this.
Absolutely confident that the 17 Knesset members, along with Mr. Netanyahu, will absolutely secure continued cooperation and support for those policies.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the West Bank issue. That's actually been in the news here recently. Gary, if you could throw that headline up there. This is in a letter signed by 15 Likud ministers currently in government, as well as Speaker Ohana. The lawmakers wrote that after the state of Israel's historic achievements in the face of Iran's axis of evil and its sympathizers, the task must be completed, and the existential threat from within must be eliminated to prevent another massacre in the heart of our country. The politicians added that the strategic partnership, backing and support of the U.S. and President Donald Trump have made it a propitious time to move forward. So that seems to kind of validate exactly what you just said, that that's what their intent here is to come, is to railroad President Trump in the United States. Is he going to allow that?
Absolutely. It's not a question of what he will allow. He'll receive instructions as to what is to be done. And that's what will happen.
Don't try this baking soda trick unless you're ready to last all night until she says stop. Last Thursday night, I thought
We need to understand something. If you're in the leadership of the Jewish state in the Middle East right now, you can do one of two things. You can pursue to its bitter end the policies that we're describing in both Gaza and the West Bank. You can pursue to its bitter end the destruction of the Iranian state in some way. We call that decapitation, regime change, whatever you want to call it. If we can break up the state, if we can create anarchy and chaos down there, whatever is required, with the help of Azerbaijan and the Turks. That's what we're going to do. And we are going to support that because the Jewish state understands that right now they have effective control of us. Let there be no mistake about it. The Hill and the White House are captives of the Israel lobby. If you look at key positions, the key people that surround the president, key people in the bureaucracy, defense, the State Department, and so forth, all of these people are creatures of the Israel lobby. Then you go across to the Senate, you start adding up, looking at the names of who's going to pass what legislation. You saw that in the interview between Tucker and Senator Cruz. I mean, these people are all alike. They have benefited in material and political ways from the connection with the Israel lobby. They are going to do what the Israel lobby wants. So these things will happen.
So what do you think of President Trump's claim over the weekend that I think that when Netanyahu comes here, we're going to get a ceasefire, 60-day ceasefire in the Gaza war leading to an end of the conflict? What do you make of that?
Well, you may get some kind of ceasefire, although none of the ceasefires that we've had were very meaningful. I don't think the alleged ceasefire right now between Iran and Israel is meaningful. I would view these things as pauses. Israel can use a pause. It's going to take between now and sometime in September for the Israelis to regain the missile arsenal, the radars, the integration, all of those things that are necessary to protect the Jewish state in the Middle East.
So that's an interesting point by Doug. He is predicting, he is estimating that the Israelis and the Americans won't be ready to fight again, until September. Now, we've been hearing, a lot of rumblings that Israel may be ready to fight again right now.
Yes, I've heard that too.
But I have to say, I don't see it, because the damage done to Israel and to its military machine by Iran, and the damage currently being done by Hamas, so severe that I don't think that the Israelis can mount a serious air attack again for some time to come.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if the Iranians decide to hit them on Cyprus? I mean, right now, those planes are going back to Cyprus to land there. The Iranians threatened months ago that if Cyprus allowed its air bases to be used by the Israelis, that Iran would consider attacking the Israeli planes there in Cyprus. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Iran does that. Cyprus is well within the range of the Iranian missiles.
Mm-hmm.
They can catch all the planes on the ground and destroy the whole force of F-35s there. So I think Doug may be right that the Israelis will think they cannot possibly go again until the fall. Also, the U.S. right now is very short itself of, interceptor missiles that would be necessary for the defense of Israel. I mean, all the interceptor missiles were gone, and we don't have the capacity to manufacture them in, double quick time. I mean, we have a capacity to I think it was, how many THAAD interceptor missiles can we make per year? 90 to 100, something like that, even only 80. In other words, the THAAD system, can't really be relied upon anyway, but even if we could use it, there are no interceptor missiles for it. The Israelis are out of interceptor missiles for the Iron Dome, and they're low when it comes to David Sling as well. And they're low with the arrow interceptors. I mean, all of the different interceptors, the supplies are low. At the end of the 12-day war, the Iranians were coming in with their ballistic missiles completely uncontested. So I just don't think the Israelis are ready. Their military bases in Israel all sustained significant damage. The loss of life was also significant. I think Doug is right. They're not going to be able to do anything again until September. I think they might make noise, and they might try to violate, ceasefires. But I think the Iranians are going to respond very harshly to any violations of ceasefires. And that's only going to increase the problem of the Israelis being ready for September. Because if there are, more Iranian waves of hundreds of missiles, being fired at the same targets, more and more damage will be done to those targets. Now, they were talking about a month, to get the refinery in, Haifa ready again. But if the Iranians send more waves of missiles to Haifa, it's going to be a lot longer than a month. And the port of Haifa will be cold. The port of Ashdod will be closed. The port of Eilat has been closed for months. Another attack, on Ben Gurion Airport. The Israelis don't have the horses to stop these attacks right now. So I think Doug is right. Things are going to be quiet until September. And even then, I don't know if the Israelis could get ready by September. They lost so much. I know Netanyahu is, very, very aggressive. But still, I just don't think they're ready.
And also sort of reinforce its striking power in the air and with missiles. That takes time. They absolutely need this pause. We kind of need a pause, but they need it more than we do, and we will shift whatever we have to them, and they know that. At the same time, whatever we have will be on standby for them at sea or in the air, and potentially even on land, depending upon where you are in the region. So I see September as the point when all of this sort of breaks into the open. So a 60-day agreement with Hamas is eminently possible. The problem is that Hamas knows that. Hamas wants an end to the war. They're not going to get that. They are scheduled for extinction. The only way out for Hamas and the people that live in Gaza is death.
Okay, I don't agree with that. Okay, I think Hamas has been increasingly successful, in its attacks on the Israelis. They keep on having the capability to fight in spades. The Israeli army, meanwhile, is being degraded in terms of the morale it has and in terms of, of the equipment it has. There's a report out, I don't know if it's true, that the Israelis just lost 50 tanks, okay, and their personnel to booby traps that were set by Iranian commandos, in the Gaza area. If that's true, those tanks are, not replaceable at all. And they lost people, a serious number of people. And the psychological impact of the whole caper on the Israelis, the morale impact was very, very heavy on, the whole Israeli army. And the Israeli population, their morale can't be doing very well in face of the damage caused by the missiles, from Iran. So, if the Israelis keep on violating the ceasefire, and by the way, uh, uh, the Iranians were starting to reply to attacks on Gaza. Now, there's supposed to be a ceasefire, and the Israelis started attacking again in Gaza, and that got them another wave of missiles. If the Iranians keep on sending missiles every time the Israelis attack in Gaza, that's going to set back everything. And is going to create a situation more and more serious for the Israelis where they may feel they have to settle. And as I already said, there can be no settlement without including the Palestinians, because the Iranians and the Houthis, and probably Hezbollah as well, they're coming back into the fray again. They won't allow it.
Expulsion, one of the two.
Do you know what blueberries do to your nerves? Watch this. Most doctors say nerve damage is permanent, but if that's true,
And that's the Israeli position. That is our position. We support it. Same thing is going to become true increasingly for the West Bank. And the same thing is effectively true for Iran. Either Iran collapses, disintegrates, or, we fail. And effectively, Trump was seen as having.
Just for the record, I think we're going to fail, when it comes to Iran.
Failed. Now, in reality, he didn't, because he bought the Israelis time, which they desperately needed. They needed the break in the war with Iran, and they still need time right now. Iran is pretty much recovered from what it went through during the 12-day war and is going to be much stronger, much more resilient, much more robust in the future. However, it has a vulnerability, and that vulnerability right now is northwestern Iran and Tabriz and the Azeri invasion. Now, I don't think the Iranians are going to take that sitting down. In other words, I think they'll react very, very decisively when the time comes. And that may mean missile strikes on Azerbaijan that the Azeris may not have reckoned with. We'll see. But the point is, this is where things are really headed.
I don't think Azerbaijan is ready for heavy missile attacks, on the part of Iran. They have no way to reply either. I mean, I don't know what game they've been playing, but they've been acting against both the Russians and the Iranians at the same time. Their military assets are, extremely limited. They have only 10 million people. It's a very small country. If they keep it up, oh, and by the way, they've been supplying oil to the Israelis, so they've been essential for the war effort there. So the Russians, and the Iranians have considerable incentive to treat them very harshly if they keep up, what they've been doing. And the Iranians certainly have the means to do that.
And what we do now is tactical. Strategically, the path into the future is set. What I described is where we're headed, what's going to happen. Our vulnerability, aside from potential weaknesses in the force structure and problems with the armed forces that we don't need to go into right now, the larger issue for us is financial. And since we've abandoned any pretense of fiscal discipline and we're piling on more debt, we are on the edge of the abyss, and we're going to fall into that abyss.
So he gets back to the debt again.
That gets me crazy.
That gets me crazy too, because he's just being ignorant.
Yes, repeating ignorance.
He doesn't know what the MMTers have done. He's not come to grips, with MMT. If he had come to grips with it, he would talk about it. He would say the MMTers are wrong for this reason, for that reason, for the other reason. But what he's exhibiting is an ignorance of the work, of MMT. And he doesn't appear to know that that work invalidates what he's saying concerning the debt.
and I don't know exactly when it happens or how it happens, but renewing your threats against nations with tariffs, reinvigorating the wars overseas and continuing to fight the ones that we've got. All of these things are going to coincide with problems here at home with the financial system. You know, jobless claims are up. The real estate market is grossly overpriced. So is the stock market. Everybody says, well, the stock market's way up. Remember that stocks, investments are emotional events. People emote. It doesn't matter what reality is until reality bites you. And when reality bites, everything is over. But for the moment, it's all emotion. And when President Trump made this statement, I'm going to appoint someone to replace Jerome Powell who will cut interest rates, everybody goes to the market and buys, and the market goes up. He says, well, the stock market's way up. Remember that stocks, investments are emotional events. People emote. It doesn't matter what reality is until reality is underway. Now, I don't think it's going to work. I think the bond market's
Okay, I'm going to stop. Oh, wait a minute. I meant to
going
go
to explode. The foreign investment that we need to sustain ourselves is not coming in.
Okay, he thinks, and he said it there, but I sort of garbled the video, but he said it there. He pointed out that he thinks the bond markets are not controlled by the government.
Why is Amazon paying me $63,000 a month? Well, I didn't make this kind of money.
Yeah.
I don't see
he thinks the bond markets are controlled by the investors. Now, it's quite clear that the interest rates on bonds are a policy variable controlled by the collaboration of the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Treasury Department. It has to do with the issuance of debt instruments by the Treasury. It has to do with the overnight rates that are set by the Fed. The Fed can have any overnight rates it wants to have, and the bond markets cannot do anything about it. Because if the bond markets want to drive up the interest rates, all the Fed has to do is to get more money into the markets, more cash, into the markets. And then that is going to lower the price of money. Private investors who try to fight with the Fed concerning the interest rates have no way of competing with the power of the Fed to actually create money and get it into the market. So that, is the basic point. The bond vigilantes appear sometimes to control the bond markets because the Fed isn't doing what it could be doing to fight them. But if the Fed wants to fight, then the Fed can always control the market and the interest rates on bonds, that are paid, in the market. And the Treasury Department never has to issue any bonds that are much higher than the overnight rates, set by the Fed. So that's the truth. And he's wrong about that. And the bond markets don't have the power to drive up the rates so high that they give the government any trouble at all.
changing.
In the last few minutes we have here, Doug, that you've just described what you think is likely to happen, what all the signals indicate. Yeah,
I don't see.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here and move it forward by a few minutes to the very last thing here. I want to move it forward to here. About there.
Thing really shakes us up. FDR had this problem in the 1930s. He had to bring on Pearl Harbor. Now, he didn't know it was going to be Pearl Harbor. He thought it was going to happen first in the Philippines, but he did everything he could to goad the Japanese into war. So much so that in June of 1941, when he made it clear we're going to embargo the Japanese, no more oil, tin, rubber, everything, that Marshall called the CNO and said, we need a joint planning conference. They had a joint planning conference, said, we know what's coming next, war with Japan. Now that's fact. They knew it was inevitable once that embargo was imposed. And everything was done.
So why did FDR want to get into war, with Japan? The reason was he wanted to get into war with Germany. He wanted to be able to do something to save the Europeans from domination by the Germans. And the easiest way that he could do that he could find a justification for declaring war on Germany, was to goad, the Japanese into an attack on us, so we could declare war on the Japanese. And also the Japanese were allied with the Germans. So we could also declare war, on the Germans. And then the limitations on FDR in terms of helping the British and helping the French and helping others to get rid of the Nazis, those constraints would be gone because, we were in the war. So it's important to keep that in mind.
To stall, to obstruct, to disrupt any kind of negotiation with Japan that might have led down a different path. And the Japanese, as we know, attacked. And remember what Hirohito said after the attack. Well, we've launched our attack. We've made our point. Now we want peace. And what did Donald Trump say? We made our attack. That's it. And now we're going to have peace. It's back to Donald Trump's theory of warfare. Bomb in the morning, send coffee and sandwiches over in the afternoon, and by 6 p.m. you have a peace agreement. No. Impossible. Yeah. What we're seeing is really what a lot of people are pointing to and saying, this is the beginning of World War III. What's happening in the Middle East, not what's happened in Ukraine, but what's happening in the Middle East. And could that have an impact in Ukraine? Of course it can. It's going to end the Ukraine war sooner. In other words, the gloves come off, it's over, done, because we Russians are focusing elsewhere. But in the meantime,
that's what we're seeing, in Ukraine right now. We're seeing the Russians make a bid to end the war very quickly there. Their bombings of Kyiv and Ukraine have been intensifying now very, very quickly and very, very decisively. And the question is whether the Ukraine, can avoid a collapse. We have to see whether that's so. But the Russians are trying to free themselves up so they can concentrate on what's happening in West Asia. And the Chinese and Russians are rushing to the aid of the Iranians at this point, because Iran is central to their plans for BRICs. Very, very important to their plans, for BRICs. So I spent far too much time on this video, but there was a lot to say. So, there is that.
I agree. There was a lot to say.
Okay, I will be checking comments now, so we can do that. Okay. After the hellos, and hello Dawn and Steve Wolfbrand and Evelina. Steve says, yes, you can grow out of debt. Wayne Santelben, hello Wayne, says, I feel it won't be long before Israel and Iran come to blows again. Uneasy ceasefire one will take over from U.S. and a dirty bomb could happen. Yeah, the Iranians, uh, okay, if they go for a nuclear weapon, the first one may be fairly primitive, and it may be a dirty bomb, I guess. I don't think they'll want to do that, but they may feel they have no choice. Evelina says, if Israel and Iran come to blows again, it may provide Iran with just the reason for the final knockout. Oh, I agree. Willie Bragg is here. Hiya, Willie. Says, hello, everyone. Evelina says, I thought the planes in Cyprus were civilian planes. Could it be warplanes or somewhere else? Not on Cyprus. Well, I've heard that the Israelis have sent the F-35s over to Cyprus now. May be wrong about that. Evelina says, I'm no expert, obviously. My intuition tells me Israel cannot help itself. It will strike again before September. Well, I don't know if it's Israel or, Netanyahu. He perhaps cannot help himself. I think there's much to be said for that intuition, that if they strike again before September, they won't have the time to get the interceptor missiles they need to avoid tremendous damage, from the next wave of Iran. I think the next wave of Iran in a full-scale war, they're going to throw everything they have, at Israel. I don't know if Israel can survive that. Russia can end this war quickly, and that is to stop the war. No, Robert, it can't. What you're ignoring is that what the Russians want to do. Oh, by the way, Mr. Wonderful says, hello, everyone. Hello, comrades. Hello, Mr. Wonderful. What the Russians want to do, is to address the causes of the war, in Ukraine. And everyone knows what the causes of the war were. They were the desire of the Western powers to have regime change, in Russia, and even if they could, to break up the Federation. Those were the real causes, of the war. And Russia will not end this war until they've removed any possibility that can be done. The United States hasn't been willing to negotiate that kind of end to the war. All the United States wants is a freeze so the Western powers have time to rearm, Ukraine. The Russians won't agree to that. It doesn't make sense for them. They're winning the war. They're going to go all out to win. Anybody know what's going on in Syria? I don't know if anything in particular is going on in Syria. I think al-Shara is trying to consolidate his control in Syria. I know in the process, his people are killing Christians, and Alawites, and other minorities. They're behaving very, very badly. I don't know what the Turks are doing. Exactly. They're probably putting pressure on the Kurds. I'm sure that's happening right now, in Syria. I don't know what the Israelis are doing, but I think their forces in Syria have to be getting very worried about what's happening at home. So I don't know what's going to happen there. But let us get to our next piece at this point, which is very long. I can already see that tonight we won't have time to go over the two videos that we planned that deal, with BRICs. So I'll have to postpone those until Tuesday. But our next video, which we're going to get to now, is an absolutely great one. And this is an interview that Chris Hedges And, it's Alistair Crook. Okay, and it is one heck of an interview. We'll be covering most of the interview. We'll be covering the first 45 minutes of the interview, and then a later segment from about 53:11 to 57:34. So I'm going to share the interview now, and we'll be doing commentary on it as we go through it.
You have to put it up on the screen.
Oh, sorry.
West. Rather than weaken the Iranian regime, these attacks have enraged Iranians, especially young Iranians, who poured into the streets in the millions for the funerals of the victims of Israel's attacks.
I was really struck by that scene. That is just an incredible number, of people.
It has hardened the resolve of Iran's rulers, who have suspended cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency and rejected calls by the Trump administration to resume negotiations. Joining me to discuss the fallout from this 12-day war and what comes next is Alistair Crook, a former British diplomat who served for many years in the Middle East, working as a security advisor to the EU Special Envoy to the Middle East, as well as helping lead efforts to set up negotiations and truces between Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other Palestinian resistance groups with Israel. He is also the author of Resistance, the Essence of the Islamist Revolution, which analyzes the ascendancy of Islamic movements in the Middle East. You can find his work at conflictsforum.substack.com. Let's begin with a question has puzzled me since these attacks began, and that is why it was so easy for Israel to take out Iran's air defenses, which were a mixture of Iranian-produced air defenses, of course, but also Russian air defenses.
Well, there's a certain deception about what happened there. I know that it's advertised by Israel and by many in the United States that there was open skies and that Israel could actually come across and destroy the air defenses. That actually is not true. In fact, if you look, you'll find there is not a single video. Many people were taking, shots from their smartphones and things, not a single video of an Israeli aircraft over Tehran or...
That is really amazing. Really amazing. I'm sure he's right, though. I haven't seen a single video of an Israeli aircraft that was over Iran. Well, maybe the Israelis will watch this video and start to produce some videos of Israeli aircraft over Iran. It'll be interesting if that happens. But somehow I don't think they're going to be able to.
Iran as a whole. What happened? It's really very interesting because it has a very important impact. What happens was that well before the 13th of June surprise attack that Israel mounted on Iran, Israel Mossad and its special forces were pre-positioning strike anti-tank weapons from Kurdistan area, from Erbil and the Kurdistan area of Iraq, across the border into Iran, quite close as they could get to the air defense systems that were present. And then
2.5 years ago, when Russia started this senseless war, Ukraine asked us to deliver the same
special forces, Israeli, and the Israelis have admitted they had special forces in Iran at that time. And the special forces then were using ballistic missiles guided by American software, the Battlescape software system onto the targets that they wanted.
That's pretty specific intelligence that Alistair had there. He knew about the software system they were using.
Now, there were no aircraft crossing into Iranian airspace, except that some aircraft from Israel flew right along the north of Iran, which is very mountainous and really deserted, into Azerbaijani airspace. And from Azerbaijan, Israel launched drones, attack drones. They didn't have such a big warhead, but they also then flew down the Caspian till they were opposite Tehran. And from there, the Israeli planes fired these latest ballistic cruise missiles. Those are the ones that hit Tehran and made a big impact on it. Now, so it was a very complicated setup.
So I've never heard that sort of narrative before, concerning what happened. In other words, the specifics of it, flying across the top of Iran, Azerbaijani airspace, and then flying down the Caspian, to get close to Tehran. I never heard that story before. It's, I think, very interesting.
That it had taken months, if not years, for Mossad to put all of those into position, to infiltrate people, pre-position them. What took out the Iranian air defenses in that first day was actually a cyber attack, a really major cyber attack on their air defenses. And they managed to undo that and to correct it with 8 hours, after which their air defenses were working again. And you can see there's evidence, we can see quite clear evidence of that happening. Why was Iran in such a vulnerable position? Well, that's quite interesting too, because actually on that day, the 13th of June, long scheduled, and with the Iranians expecting to go to talks on the Sunday with Witkoff in Oman and the Americans to talk about the nuclear program, the IRGC had a big program, a big exercise prepared with naval and other forces engaged with us. And some of the missile launches were actually exposed and put out because of this big exercise. I think it involved the Chinese too, as well. But so they were all in this headquarters in a single room in the headquarters when Israeli decapitated the line commanders.
So you might think that was good fortune, but obviously the Israelis must have known about these exercises and must have known that they would have the opportunity to get a number of the Iranian security chiefs in one place, and so they would be able to hit them there. But that's the first time I've heard the account of how they hit them in such very specific terms. And it's very plausible that it was all related to an exercise which the Allies were doing, which caused all these security chiefs to come together in one place.
Of the IRGC and the military staff who were all preparing for this big exercise. And they were taken by surprise and the decapitation happened. What happened with the civilian scientists, they were killed by spike missiles fired directly and small ballistic missiles fired by probably the special forces, I'm not quite sure, into their homes. Precise strikes into the homes, killing them and their families. Two, I think it's 10 or 11 scientists were killed. So.
Okay, initial reports were much higher about the number of scientists who were killed. I think it's probably fairly easy for the Iranians to overcome the loss of 11 nuclear scientists. Also, there weren't as many security chiefs killed as initially thought. There were some of them who showed up alive after those original attacks, as we'll see in just a moment.
That was really what happened. Now, there are two important things that flow from this. The first is this setup is not repeatable. You can't, it was a very sophisticated, long prepared, positioning people in the site, both from the north, from Azerbaijan, and across the border from Kurdistan, the MEK, coming across the Kurdistan, setting all these up.
Saying the MEK came across from Kurdistan inside of Iraq, came across the border to the part of Kurdistan, that's in Iran, and attacked from there. The MEK is also the group, that the Turks, are trying to get rid of because they operate in Turkey also. They operate across the whole of Kurdistan, that whole arc that goes into Iran from Iraq.
Cyber attack was set up and prepared, and everything was ready for this. But now it's exposed. You can't go back to it. And also that now, the Iranian air defenses are fully operational. They're getting more air defenses from the Chinese. So it won't be the same. You can't just repeat that operation. And the talk about open skies was very deceptive. It was really a lie. It wasn't open skies. It was actually something rather different that happened. So that's very important that, it's not something can be repeated. Israel can't do this next week or the week after. It would take months, if possible. But in the meantime, Iran is, of course, operating in around Erbil in Kurdistan. You've probably seen there been many explosions and attacks there. In the north, they're removing Baluchis and refugees from across the border from that area. And there is a half conversation taking place between Russia and Aliyev, the head of the Azeri state, and also from Iran. So there is a great deal of tension there from Azerbaijan and Russia about different things. But it used to have good relations, but now it's very tense indeed there. The Russians suspect that not only those tactics of infiltration of saboteurs were done, if you like, during that attack on Russia's strategic bomber force out of Kazakhstan, but they think that some of them were done by part of the illegal and criminal gangs who are Azeris as well as Russian citizens. And behind this, Russia sees the hand of Turkey and NATO for both the attack in Iran and also the attack that took place. I think it was called the Spider's Web attack on those strategic bombers that were out in the open on again the day before peace talks were taking place.
Let's talk about the American strike. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was my understanding that the Israelis did take out air defenses to open a corridor for American bombers, but maybe that's incorrect. And secondly, let's talk about 408 kilograms of enriched uranium. I think they're supposedly at 60%. But let's talk about the American strike.
Well, the Americans warned these Iranians beforehand, either I think probably through the Swiss embassy in Tehran or through, equally likely through Oman, warned them in advance and also told them it was once and done, i.e. it would be one strike, finish, end of the process. So they passed that information to the Iranians. And I believe, I can't vouch for it perfectly, but my understanding is that the Russians said to them, look, just let it happen. It's much better, just let it happen. You probably won't, it won't be as damaging as it may be advertised. Just let it happen. And it's true, because on that time, it's fairly clear. There was no evidence you can see of any great, if you like, air defenses being used or mounted or explosions. Iranians tell me, I was in Iran just before this happened. The Iranians tell me it was very quiet that night. There was nothing happening. So they just came in, they did what they wanted to do, and then they left. What success they had? Well, nobody can really say. I mean, at this stage, anyone who tells you or says they know, I don't think is telling the truth, because the only way you know, there are about 5 entrances to Fordo, 5 different entrances. 2 of them were blocked up with soil by the Iranians before the strike, 2 days before. And the whole basis of this depends on a very controversial piece of, if you like, mechanics. Most of those entrances to the Fordo base have got blast bends in them. In other words, if there's an explosion, it can't go any further. It can't reach the centrifuge hall. Centrifuge hall, don't forget, is at 800 meters depth in this mountain.
Teenagers are building businesses with AI, while the only AI you know is ChatGPT.
Let's be real. Most people over.
And then.
Okay, that figure of 800 meters, okay, in the mountain for Fordo, it's the first time I'd heard about that. I mean, I previously heard about, maybe 200 meters or something like that. But 800 meters is far down. That's about a half a mile down. That's very far.
And there is an event. And this is a source of controversy in America anywhere else, is according to the Americans and who briefed Trump, the vent had no, if you like, bend in it. It was vertical, straight from the surface down to the centrifuge hall. And many
So for the Iranians to have done that, they would have had to have been idiots.
experts, professors from MIT and others are very adamant in saying it's unbelievable that the Iranians would have put blast vents in all of the entrances, but have forget to do it in the vent. Well, I don't know the answer to that. You'll have to go and ask the professor about that. But
the professor is Ted Postal. He's been all over the internet, okay, with his analyses of the likely damage that came from the blasts.
Yes, 4 days beforehand, there were trucks at Fordo, and the Iranians, and there's some, I think there's some reasonably reliable reporting that the highly enriched uranium was removed and probably deposited in this other site called Pickaxe Mountain, which is also quite close to Qom. And I would think it's probably hidden there somewhere. It's even deeper than Fordo. Seems to be off the radar.
Okay, so QOM is QOM. Okay, and inside of Iran, that's like a holy city, a center, okay, of Shiism. That's where the Ayatollahs are, for the most part.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that is probably where it is. But until the Iranians clear one of these entrances, I mean, which they deliberately blocked up to sort of stop pressure rising, and go into the hall, we won't know how much damage is done. But I think the Isfahan one also is very deep. And it's quite likely that centrifuges were not destroyed at Isfahan. Nantas is different.
So that assumes, in other words, what Alistair is saying now assumes that the centrifuges remained in the hall. Okay, there was a lot of talk that there was a sufficient amount of warning, not only for the uranium, to be removed from the area, but the centrifuges also, because they were big trucks, okay, that came. And there were enough trucks to take away the centrifuges. And now, of course, maybe some of the centrifuges were taken away, and and not others. But, I don't know what the details of that were, but it's very unlikely, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that some of them were taken away, that all the centrifuges were destroyed, in the bombing. In fact, I think the likelihood is that not many centrifuges were destroyed. There was a lot of talk also before the attack. Well, first of all, there was identification of a lot of other nuclear sites, okay, inside of Iran. And there was talk about some new nuclear sites being under construction. And some talk about how the Iranians had the intention of shifting some of the centrifuge efforts, to some of the newer sites, which were even more impervious to attack than the Fordo site was. So, I don't know what they did, but they were going deep into the mountains, to set up these new sites. So we should keep all that in mind.
Nantas is very old. It's there from the Shah's time. It's mostly on the surface. I remember passing it, and you could, it's there and you see it. But they put the centrifuges down, I think, between 60 and 80 meters. So, maybe they're badly damaged. Who knows? but they don't need many centrifuges. One of the things that this professor from MIT, Postel says that, once you get to a certain point in the enrichment process, then it becomes exponential. You just have to do a tiny bit more and that you're up at 90%. So, I mean, they don't need many centrifuges to survive.
Hurricanes, wildfires, and freak storms happen more and more every year. Hurricane Helene destroyed 8.
Okay, by the way,
The pilots.
Scott Ritter still thinks the Iranians are only days away from having a nuclear weapon, okay, if they want one. They're very close in terms of the enrichment. Basically, one more cycle can get them from 60% up to 90%. And he also thinks the Iranians have been doing work to prepare the context for the nuclear material so that, they can be fitted onto warheads. So there are various estimates. Some people are still saying it would be a half year till they had a nuclear weapon. Some people are saying a year. But Scott Ritter has a tremendous amount of expertise in terms of, how nuclear weapons are created and the background and context of the creation, of nuclear weapons. I personally trust his judgment, that the Iranians are only days away.
I agree with that too.
Yeah, I think if they desire a nuclear weapon at this point, they might even have one as we speak.
Right, because they're getting help from their allies.
Yeah, but I don't even think they needed help. In other words, I think that they already prepared the missiles and warheads to carry the weapons. They already designed the weapons, because I think what's going on is the IRGC wanted to do that, and they wanted to have the weapons, have wanted to have it for a long time. And all they were waiting for was for the fatwa to be changed.
Yes, that's true. I read that too.
Right. And so it's perfectly possible that in reaction to the attack by the United States, and the Israeli attack as well, but the joint attack, of both, to try to get at, the nuclear deterrent, or something that could become a nuclear deterrent, that the Supreme Leader just finally said, okay, this is an existential threat. If it's an existential threat, then we're allowed to, to use the nuclear weapons. And so he might have withdrawn the fatwa. We have no way of knowing that at this point. But if he withdrew it, then the IRGC, according to Scott, was only days away. And they've had days, since the attack. The attack was when? June 23rd. It's now July 12th. They've had the time they need. And they've it was estimated that the 408 kilograms of U-235 that they had would have been sufficient for 6 to 9 warheads. So they might be having, 6 to 9 missiles now ready to fire. They'd mount them on hypersonic missiles, of course, for which the Israelis don't have any defense. And if they did that, that would mean they have the capability right now to destroy Israel, because 6 to 9, nuclear weapons would be enough to destroy that very small country. So I'm not saying that's happened, but I'm saying that the Iranians might have returned right now. If they've gone that route, then it's likely that in the next few weeks they would simply announce that they have that and say to the United States, okay, and say to the Israelis, well, we have our nuclear weapons now. If you dare to attack us first, we will destroy you. And the Iranians could well point out, look, if you're going to send over a B-2 bomber with tactical nukes to hit us, we can assure you that our hypersonic missiles tipped, with nuclear weapons will arrive in Israel before your B-2 bomber gets to us, because that bomber is slow. Anyway, let's go on.
Talked about seeing explosions, but what I heard, that was in fact not a good sign.
Yes, that's right. That is a sign that there was a blast bend on the vent, and so the blast was coming up, and that's why I had a spectacular view of explosion, because it hadn't gone.
So that's a very important point. The fact that you could see the explosion was coming up does mean that the vent that the bombs were dropped down did have these bends. And the bends were there to create, an explosion going up and out rather than down to the centrifuge hall.
Down to the centrifuge floor, it had come up and was at the surface. So it isn't necessarily a good indicator of that. So that was really the gist of it. That I think it was clear, that Trump wanted it, and we know quite a lot about that day because someone, and I wrote about it since you, and I'm sure you probably know Michael Wolff, who's written 4 books on Trump, and he was talking and calling. He works by calling interlocutors that Trump has just spoken to on the phone. And he says it's a really reliable way of finding out what Trump is thinking, because he says the same question to each interlocutor. And it's not really a question. So on the 12th, it seemed that on the 22nd, rather, the day of the American strike, Trump was quite anxious, according to Michael Wolff. And he kept asking people, is it going to work? Is it going to be a win? Is it going to be, a game changer? I'm hoping for a game changer. We want something that is perfect. And this will be, a big headline and a big win. And I want the headline, we won. And so he says there was, an element of sort of.
That all certainly sounds like Trump, doesn't it?
Lack of confidence almost in Trump. He went on saying the same thing. This is what it's got to be. In, boom, out. In, boom, out, ceasefire. And so that's how it was presented.
Because he wanted to serve coffee and crackers in the afternoon. Or was it coffee and cookies? I forget what Doug McGregor said.
And actually, this suits the Iranians quite well, because he says, and insists, obliterated. Everything has been obliterated. There's nothing left. It's all over. No nuclear program. Well, this is fine from the Iranian point of view, because they say, well, then, to sort of Macron and others who's saying, well, will the IEA have to go back and sort of inspect and find out what's going on? And they say, but it's you who say it's all over. There isn't a program, so why do we need the IEA in there at all? In fact, the IEA are already out, and their return, I'm not exaggerating this, they need huge bodyguards if they ever went back to Iran. They are hated with a huge intensity by the ordinary population because they believe that particularly the assassination of the scientists and the identification of them came from the IEA artificial intelligence program Mosaic, which is one of the, if you like, Palantir stable.
Have you ever wondered how buying Israeli goods helps Israel during turbulent times?
Of targeting systems, which.
Okay, so that's a picture of Peter Thiel, of course. Okay. And, you know, the Mosaic system is from the Palantir software company that he heads. And they had some AI that was built into this. And they sold the software, and the software was sold to the IAEA. And they were using that software. And the relations between Palantir and Israel, Peter Thiel and Israel, okay, are very, very close. And Israeli personnel penetrated the IAEA, and there is not much doubt that the thinking inside of the IAEA and the information the IAEA had concerning Iran, the data they had concerning Iran, including the identifications of the nuclear scientists and locations of the nuclear scientists, were transmitted from the IAEA to the Israelis. And what is most shocking to me and makes me most angry about this is the Israelis have steadfastly refused to join the NPT, the treaty, okay, you know, the non-proliferation treaty. They are not members, okay, of that organization. And the IAEA, they allowed the transfer of critical security information to a non-member and therefore betrayed the security of a member of the NPT. That is totally unacceptable. It seems to me it justifies the destruction of the IAEA and the creation of a completely new organization and the removal of all the IAEA personnel from the scene. I mean, that was just a betrayal. If members of the NPT can't trust that their information will not be transmitted to non-members of the NPT, why the hell should anybody join the IAEA? Why should they allow inspections? Why should they allow their information to be exposed to non-members who might be, and in this case were, hostile to them? I mean, this is just a scandal. It's a scandal that cannot be compensated for. The IAEA cannot be allowed to continue as an organization because it bankrupts the NPT. It means the treaty is no longer viable, you know, no longer useful.
Relies on imputing motives to people, not on evidence. This is where you get the great disparity with Tulsi Gabbard, for example, because what the IEA were using was this data gathering process, examining 400 million pieces of data, social, what you read on your social platforms, where you move, who your children play with, all of those things, just like.
And I have to add here, it was not really relevant because all of these indirect indicators of what the intentions of Iran weren't dispositive with respect to what the Iranians were trying to do. The reason why they were not, dispositive was because everybody knew, even before the Palantir software was introduced, everybody knew that the Iranians weren't going for a nuclear weapon because of the fatwa. And everybody also knew The IRGC wanted a nuclear weapon itself because they were being prevented by the fatwa. Everybody knew that to start with. So what would you expect in a situation like that? You would expect that the IRGC would be preparing to create and to use a nuclear weapon if the fatwa were ever changed.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were the ones who were responsible for Iranian security. So why wouldn't they prepare? Why wouldn't all the indicators show that they were preparing and that, they were accelerating? Why wouldn't the indicators all show that? You would expect the indicators to show that. But none of that would mean anything unless Palantir had some measures of what the Ayatollah was going to do. Because in this case, what the Ayatollah alone was going to do would be positive. That would provide the yes or no answer. Whether Iran was really a threat or not. Now, there's the only justification, for really attacking Iran was that they were on the point of, getting a nuclear weapon, and they had the intention of getting one. But even if all the Palantir indicators showed that they were days away from having one, unless those indicators were dealing directly with the intentions of the Ayatollah, they wouldn't be able to give a dispositive answer as to whether Iran was going to get a nuclear weapon or not. That meant that if the Israelis were paying attention to that information and they used that to inform themselves about a decision, that their decision could not be made with knowledge of what the Ayatollah was going to do. It could only be made based on the capability of Iran. But the capability of Iran to have a nuclear weapon was never in doubt in the first place. They could have had one since 2003. That situation really hasn't changed. So, the Israeli and U.S. attacks really had no justification. What was really at issue was that the U.S. and Israel were looking for an excuse, for a rationale to do regime change inside of Iran, because they always wanted to get rid of the regime there so they could pursue the greater Israel dream. That's what really caused this attack. It wasn't anything that Iran did. It was because the Israelis wanted to get rid of Iran. They've been wanting to get rid of Iran since Iran got its new regime in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
Palantir uses the same system in Israel and in Gaza to impute to Israel, to Iran, the idea that they are not being honest in moving the enriched uranium, that they're not declaring things. And so that's what happened on the 12th, the day before the Israeli attack on Iran. The board of the IAEA, on the basis of this evidence, said, oh, Iran is accelerating towards enrichment and therefore to a bomb, and this is in breach of its of the protocols of the JCPOA. This is really the pretext for the attack.
But they weren't in breach of the protocols. Why weren't they not in breach? Because the NPT does not give any specific enrichment level that the member nations are prohibited from reaching. Nowhere does it say that the members of the NPT treaty, the signatories, cannot enrich to 90%. There's no protocol that prohibits that. There's no protocol that justifies an attack on Iran based on the fact that they've enriched to 90%. It's purely a decision made by the aggressor nations who want to say that they're justified in attacking because the capability to develop a nuclear weapon quickly rests, with Iran. They were really attacking based on the capability itself and not on any reasonable analysis of the intentions of Iran.
On Iran that took place on Friday, the 13th of June. That resolution that was prepared and stage managed effectively by the IEA to give, if you like, a peg for the Israeli attack to take place, and which is why the Iranians and the Russians too are so distrustful of the IEA. And I don't think it's going back into Iran.
Well, the UN inspection teams in Iraq were riddled with foreign intelligence operatives, including Israeli. One has to assume that's also true with the IAEA.
Oh, it's completely, it's not, it's verified. We know that they were providing intelligence to Mossad and to Israel about, and of course, IEA insisted on meeting the scientists involved in the nuclear program and therefore being able to identify them. Whether this was directly passed on, I can't say, but the Iranians have intelligence which suggests that it was passed on. I haven't seen the intelligence.
Hey, if you're a guy over 50 and waking up 3, even 4 times a night just to pee.
Let's talk about the strikes on Israel. Of course, because of military censorship in Israel, we don't know the full picture. We know that refineries were hit in Haifa. We know the Weizmann Institute was hit. Reading it from a distance, it does appear that Israel was probably a little surprised at the extent of the damage that the Iranians were able to inflict.
It looked like the Weizmann Institute was destroyed, not just hit.
Exactly.
I saw some of the pictures of that. It looked like that's not coming back anytime soon.
No.
That'll take years to rebuild.
I think they were very shocked by it. They were attacked as they'd never been attacked before. They might have been used to a few Katyusha rockets from Gaza, but this was a completely different order. As you say, there's been a complete news blackout, but subsequently, from satellite images, it's clear that at least 5 military sites were destroyed by the Iranians, apart from, if you like, the main ones, which was the Akiria, which was the equivalent of the Pentagon, the Mossad headquarters in Herzliya, and various other sites as well as other damages. And those other ones are very important because this is key in their economic sense, that first of all, there was the attack on Haifa and the destruction of the refinery at Haifa. And that's been that the Israelis say will not be able to operate for at least a month. And
that's optimistic.
And then there was the attack on the Ashdod port, which destroyed the electric power system, the generators, the power generators there, which led to the blackout in about a third of the country. It's been restored. But Israel has 3 ports, Eilat, which has been closed for months, Haifa and Ashdod. Both of those were heavily attacked. And the economy was really at a halt. And this is why Israel, called to the Omanis and said, we need a ceasefire, and said the same to Americans, we need it. And the other reason was because they were running out of missiles, of intercept missiles. The Israelis themselves say 93 THAAD missiles were fired by the Americans and the Israelis in that period of the 12 days. 93, which is equivalent to 1.2 billion worth of missiles, and which is about 2 to 3 years total production capacity of THAAD missile into.
Okay, so I was overestimating the capacity to produce the THAAD missiles. 2 to 3 years, of THAAD production already expended in the 12 days of the war. That capability is not coming back for 2 to 3 years, unless, of course, it's accelerated by the United States. But what's our capacity to surge? I'm not at all sure of our capability to surge at the production of this, because we've been so busy deindustrializing over the last 30 to 40 years.
Sectors during that period. So again, not only can that operation that they did on the 13th not be easily resurrected, but at the moment, Israel is going to have to wait to re-equip itself with air defenses in a major way before they could think of attacking. Iran is doing the same. The Iranians believe and think that there will be a further attack from Israel, because it's not, they believe, in Israel's interest to accept the Trump assertion that the program is over. That Israel wants to say that the program is there, because that provides them with the cue that to say, yes, within the ceasefire, we have the right to attack when and as we want onto Iran. If we suspect that they're enriching or moving uranium, we can attack at our initiative.
So if I may be allowed to state an opinion here, I'm not really shy about that. From my point of view, I think it is in Israel's interest, to believe what Trump is saying, because that, might lead them not to attack the Iranians again, which is really in their interest, because if they do attack the Iranians again, and the Iranians reply with all they have, that could be the end of Israel. And I'm sure that's not in the interests of Israel per se. That's not what any of the Israelis want. But if they attack Iran, I think that's what they're going to get.
Is what the basis of the ceasefire in Lebanon is. That there is to be a ceasefire, but Israeli has the right to attack anywhere in Lebanon as it chooses and when it chooses. So they've been trying to impose the same terms, if you like, on Iran. And I think that is...
If stress, racing thoughts, or self-doubt keep slowing things down, this 6-minute brain shift
ultimately intended to try and pull in America to another round of attacks, because the Israeli position is still, and this is very important, really, that the Israeli position is that simply the enrichment program cannot be defeated by military systems alone. The only way ultimately to defeat it is by a regime change and the imposition of a Western style puppet government into Tehran, because they believe that they cannot kill the technical knowledge or the will to move ahead with enrichment. So I think it's pretty. If the West, I think there are two triggers that we should watch in this. If the West really pushes the Iranians to allow some sort of oversight or monitoring of the program with a reformed, perhaps IAEA or whatever. By the way, Russia won't push them very hard on that, because the IAEA, Russia has its own quarrels with the IAEA. But if the West pushes, or Trump pushes very hard on that, then I think, and it is required under the NPT, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, monitoring and accountability is part of the treaty. If that is pushed, then I think there will be an answer, which is we're leaving the NPT. And if then, which is also likely, the Euro 3 and the JCPOA push for a snapback of sanctions on Iran. And they've already said publicly that they intend to push for snapback sanctions. Part of the whole process of putting more pressure on Iran, and then, the hope that Trump keeps saying that they will then come and offer an unconditional surrender, which will never happen. But that's the plan anyway. But those two things were likely to push Iran off the NPT. What happens then? We have to wait and see. But there is a very strong patriotic mood, as you referred to in the introduction.
I think we know what happens then. Specifically, if Iran leaves the NPT and the snapback sanctions come, then the Iranians will trade within the BRICs bloc completely, using local currencies and the new Chinese system of settling transactions, across border. They've already taken the first step to using that system, because that system, makes use of the Baidu system of communications, which the Chinese have already created and is already in operation. And the Iranians just joined that, so they no longer have to use the SWIFT system. So they'd be perfectly capable of trading with all of the other BRICS nations who were willing to use the Chinese system of cross-border settlement of financial transactions. So I don't think any renewal of the snapback sanctions are going to hurt Iran very much. They're used to living under sanctions anyway, because they've had so many for so long. What they're not used to is the new opportunities they're getting through BRICS, and they'll be increasingly turning to the BRICS nations for trading opportunities, and those will be ample for them. And all the sanctions are going to mean for the West is that the Iranians will no longer be trading with the West. And I believe the West needs Iran trade more than the Iranians need Western trade. So I think that the whole snapback sanctions thing is self-defeating for the West, and for the United States. But so much of what we're doing these days is self-defeating. It's just incredible going on.
And what is so striking is it's the young, the people that people thought were not necessarily, supporters of it. And they are totally supporting the supreme leader. He's like a sort of celebrity figure now for everyone, for the young and for all. So I don't know whether they will decide to move towards a weapon or leave it in sort of strategic ambiguity. That's a possibility too.
There are 3 areas on a man's body that show he's likely got a hormone problem: chest fat.
Well, these kinds of attacks always generate that kind of blowback. I was in Buenos Aires right before the British attacked the Falklands, and the regime was about to fall, the junta. And then as soon as the attack began, these people became national Galtieri, and all these criminals became national heroes. I want to talk about that process because the supreme leader has, I think it was 2003, had written that it was against Sharia, Islamic law, to build a nuclear weapon.
That's perfectly true, but there is some important element. Under Sharia jurisprudence, there's a thing called ijtihad. which is that you can change law through reasoning, through a process of reasoning. And that reasoning can be changed on the basis of time and circumstances. So that if it's no longer appropriate because, the world has moved on and life is different, or because of a changed circumstances, then a jurist, it has to be a jurist. It's not a political decision, but a qualified jurist, Hojat al-Islam or more senior, can actually change the law, and a new fatwa can be issued very easily. It doesn't need, parliamentary or pew. But there is a majority in Iran now of people who argue that it was a mistake never to go down this route, and that this is going to be something that is going to be really much more, and this is something the Russians have alluded to, which I think is quite significant. They're saying actually this whole proliferation process that the West had is actually back to front, because actually it's pushing people ultimately towards a weapon, not preventing them, because this process of going around and just threatening states, we're going to bomb you to the Stone Age if you don't do what we tell you, actually has ended. And that's what happened, of course, with North Korea. I mean, they'd agreed a process of giving it up, but then more requirements were imposed. I mean, it was all agreed, and there was going to be money put in and a new process. And then the extra demands that Washington imposed on top of the original agreement prompted the North Koreans to say, oh, hang it. It's not worth it. I mean, it's much better that we should go for a bomb. So, I mean, the Russians and others are saying, well, this whole non-proliferation, actually the real proliferators at this moment is the West, because they keep pushing people towards thinking the only thing that they need. And look what's happened. They bombed Iran, and now Saudi Arabia is talking about a weapon. Now India is expressing concerns about it and what the consequence will be. Other states will be pursuing it. So actually, rather than stopping proliferation, acting to stop proliferation, as the West says it's doing, it is actually encouraging proliferation. That's the Russian view. Medvedev said that, the vice president said that quite recently.
Yes, of course, that's right.
We also have the example of Gaddafi, who gave up his program.
Exactly. Exactly. It wasn't too difficult to take away, I remember, because it was still in its packing cases. He hadn't even unpacked it, and it was removed. Anyway, that was, yes, there isn't a good history by this.
Well, let's talk about the increased drone activity that apparently is occurring over Iran and what that means.
The Israeli drone activity over Iran at the moment is not attack drones. It is mostly surveillance drones. They're sort of trying to scope out radar and the sort of the time it takes for radar to lock onto them and where the radar is. And that is being fed into the American, only the Americans have this sort of satellite-based battlescape map that sort of tracks all radar and air defenses so that you can, if you like, instruct your missiles to sort of do a slalom between all the impediments to reach your target. So that's what's happening at the moment. Plus, and I heard this from Tehran just yesterday, they're under huge cyber attack from all NATO, they say. I mean, there's a big cyber attacks going. So I think, both parties expect there will be another round, and Iran certainly, and Israel is preparing.
It's Kirsten Gillibrand, DSCC chair. Right now, Donald Trump and his MAGA agenda are tearing this country
for the next stage. So I think, although Trump, and I don't think he wanted this, I mean, from everything that Michael Wolff said about those calls, which were, I just want this to be perfect. I want this, I want this to be in, boom, out, finish, ceasefire, done. Let's close it, finish this talk. I think that what Trump is trying to do there is he does not, and Michael Wolff says, and I think this is absolutely right, he doesn't think he has the attention span to do a long, drawn-out slugfest fight with Iran. What he's trying to do is shut it down to give him enough space to get back to what really wants, which is, if you like, this new Middle East business world, this new structure whereby Lebanon and Syria and others will be brought into some form. We will have the Abraham Accords 2.0, and that through this will open a universe of business and trading possibilities through, and that he hopes that Iran can just sort of stand on the sidelines and not do anything about it till he can find some other agreement with Iran. But the main thing is the headline. Let's have a big headline. We've done it. There's a new Middle East. Everyone's in this new sort of matrix of money, investments, resources, and of course, the resources of Iran, which are so vital to China, and also the fact that the Gulf states, and that if you can take that whole, if you like, corridor of the Middle East, he can take it into southern Central Asia and disrupt the BRICs and their connectivity plans in those Stan areas, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all those areas. He can disrupt it and start moving the economic sphere into this. At the same time that he's doing, if you like, an attempt to cage China literally by tariff structures, and also weakening Russia by reigniting the tensions in the Caucasus again. And so Russia and Putin is taking this very seriously, and so is China. And they are very angry about this. They're angry about the deceit because Putin thinks he was deceived by those attacks on the strategic bombers just the day before the Istanbul talks, just as Iran is. And China believes also that Xi was cheated by Trump in the discussions that they had. So there's a real sort of sense of preparing for a new and wider Cold War that is being pushed. I mean, Kazakhstan in the north, that is, I was in Russia around about the time of the Crocus hall, of the concert hall that was burnt down. And they were Tajiks that had come down who were found to be responsible. And there was a big structure in Kazakhstan for recruiting people, Afghans and Tajiks and others, and for infiltrating them into Russia or to Iran or whatever. And now we see that Azerbaijan is engaged in the same idea. Now, the reports, I can't verify them, but recently Russia arrested a number of Azeri's Russian citizens, and that produced a dramatic response from Aliyev, who...
Okay, so a few comments before we go further. Speaking of the radar systems and the capability of the United States to map out all the radar systems and to build a model of a battlescape that includes the radar systems. I think there's a way for the Iranians to outwit that, which is actually pretty simple. That is, it'll cost money, basically, but they could probably postpone payment for a while, which is to get, twice as many radar systems up, as you need. and only turn on 1/2 of those radars. Okay, so they are the radar systems the United States sees for its, with its battlescape software. But then, as soon as the Russians get wind of an attack, coming from the Israelis, through their satellite information systems, then the Iranians can turn off the old radar systems the Americans have a map of, and instantly turn on the new radar systems that would have the same coverage. And it would take some time, for the Americans to adapt the battle escape model and give the Israelis the correct information about how to get through the radar systems. So I'm not sure it's so complicated to outwit that. But then, going further, notice the complicated sort of geopolitics that Alistair, is talking about here. How all the nations of Central Asia, get engaged in the politics of BRICs, and also the efforts of the United States to get them engaged on the side of the United States and on the side of Israel. And so the recruitment of people here and the alignment of people becomes very, very complicated. That also you can see that basically what the Mossad in Israel and the English, intelligence people and the CIA, are trying to do is they're trying to detach the Central Asians from the trend of supporting BRICs and the further development, of BRICs by basically bribing certain groups and enlisting their help in trying to create political trouble in all these states of Central Asia, around Iran. And on the other hand, the efforts of the Russians and the Chinese to shore up Iran, because Iran has such a central place in the Belt and Road Initiative and such a central place in the North-South transportation corridor the Russians are trying to build. So it's so essential for the Russians and the Chinese and the BRICS nations to support the Iranian state and the survival of the state as it currently exists, because it is committed to BRICS. And on the other hand, the well-being of that state is essential for BRICS and the important projects it's doing to facilitate the integration of Europe, and Asia for future trade and future economics. So this is all so important. Next time we'll be getting into much more detail on what was done at the BRICS conference and the progress, that has been made of late, in BRICS. But this is all tied in to the fight that's going on over Iran, and it's all tied into the politics of Israel and how Israel is trying to overthrow, the regime in Iran for its own purposes, so it can set up greater Israel. So it's all very complicated, and interwoven, and all very pregnant with tensions of all kinds and business opportunities of all kinds. It's all very interesting, but also it makes things very, very tense on a number of dimensions.
who arrested all the Sputnik journalists and many others in Azerbaijan, and they roughed them up, and they've charged them with espionage and other charges. Now, there's always been a sort of criminal groups in Russia or from Azerbaijan. They're known as sort of a mafia there. But this is more serious, I believe, because it's thinking the Russians may be suspecting that these groups were also facilitating the infiltration of some of those pre-positioned units that were ready for the attack on the strategic bomber system in Russia, the spider's web. And that also Azerbaijan was facilitating the attack on Iran. So Azerbaijan and Armenia too, and the question of Turkey's role. The United States is trying to woo Erdogan with promises of F-35s, if only he'll mothball the S-400s that he has. And I think that the Israeli aim is the key to their, if you like, their new corridor, the new, if you like, Abraham Accord 2.0, a business plan right through to Asia, is that Turkey should persuade both Syria and Lebanon that they have no choice and incentivize them both to join into this new sort of greater Israel project. So this is why there's a lot of tensions that all these proposals that are coming out of America at the moment, the intent to sort of cut off China from trade by putting differential tariffs on China if they transship goods through Vietnam or another country, the prospect of new sanctions on Russia, the attack on Iran as a pivot, a key pivot for Russia and China of the whole BRIC structure. All of these things are producing a really strong response from Russia. I mean, it's given very tough response to Trump on this and says, we know exactly what you're doing in the Caucasus. We know what you're doing in Azerbaijan, and we won't put up with it. And so Russia responded to this by destroying the 2 refineries in Ukraine that were fueled from Baku, from Azerbaijan. There was Azerbaijan input that was fueling these 2 refineries. This was a warning to Azerbaijan, stop playing around with this. So Iran will be saying something rather similar, I suspect.
Okay, so that is very important, and it's very interesting that the
Azeris.
The Azerbaijanis, or I should say actually the Azeris, are supplying oil both to the Ukrainians, and also to the Israelis. So to both sides of the conflict, which the Russians and the Iranians are opposed to. So the Azeris, I think, are finding themselves in an increasingly difficult sort of position because they're operating contrary to the Russian interests and contrary to the Iranian interests at the same time. I think that's going to be dangerous for them as we go forward.
I think some people in the United States even dream of the idea that Azerbaijan could invade at the right moment in coordination with Israel into Iran, as the Baluch perhaps come from another side or the Kurds from the other. But I think that is very far-fetched because 85% of Azeris are Shia. There is if you like, the leadership is Turkic, more than.
And when he says they're he's saying they're believers in Shiism. They shared then a religion with the Persians. Okay. So that for the longer run is very important.
The Iranian Shia, but they're Turkic, either Sunni or Shia converted. Anyway, it's very secular. And the Iranians, all the Azeris in Iran are very, very loyal to Iran. And, people talk about, well, the Azeris glass ceiling. And I slightly laugh at that. And I say, well, there's one person you probably have heard of who's a really well-known poet, and he writes in the Azeri language, and he's fluent in the Azeri language, and he is Azeri, and that's the supreme leader. So it's not that the Azeris are completely sort of outliers in Iran.
Didn't Israel launch drones from there? Isn't that a launch point?
Exactly. They launched drones, and also, as I say, the airspace of Azerbaijan was used for standoff firing of drones that had these new cruise missiles, multiple cruise missiles. They could launch them once they were in Iranian territory.
I have two last questions, but just on Gaza, because in the meeting in the White House, when reporters were allowed in
Iranian territory.
I'm going to stop it there and go forward a little to finish it up. But let me do that here. Go forward to about 53:36.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start it there.
I usually have to get an extension cord, but now I can just take this with me wherever I go.
Iran, if in Israeli eyes they feel they are reconstituting military defenses or a nuclear program, how do you picture that strike and the consequences? The next one.
I think the first thing which is really important to say is that, we follow the Israeli press very, very closely, the Hebrew press, not just the English language press. It's very clear that they know.
When he says we, he's referring to himself and his wife.
Now, after what has happened, they sustained much more damage than they had expected, that they cannot attack Iran without full, unstinting American support. Now, the question is that going to be forthcoming? And I think one of the things that I feel might stop it is the question of the MAGA. I think the MAGA are really quite unhappy. There were two issues in the American election: immigration and forever wars. And the MAGA, came, and also there is quite a number of Democrats, young Democratic voters, who supported Trump mainly because he promised peace and no more war. Not necessarily for the other part, but certainly for that. They are starting to filter away. And it's also in the MAGA, you've seen, Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and everyone, there's a big pushback against it. They have, Trump has a majority, I think you correct me if I'm wrong, about 3 in both houses, in the Senate and the House. It's small. And midterms are just over a year away. So I think he is going to be worried about the internal position, the MAGA position in that. And that was obvious almost when Hegseth came in, spoke, and he said, he went on, you may remember it, he made a statement, I think, on Fox News saying, look, we're not attacking Iran per se, or the Iranian people, we're just attacking the nuclear program. I think we're not wanting to have a war with Iran. We're just trying to, sort this part out. So I think he will, because, with only 3, it would be quite feasible. If he gets stuck and locked into a long, bloody conflict in Iran, and it would be, because Iran's got surprises for the United States and for Israel, if it moves to another phase. Everyone is preparing for another phase. If it does that, he may find that, at the end of it, it will be a very different world.
Okay, so I sort of disagree there in the following sense. I don't think Israel can exist if the war is a long war. I think the next big wave, of Iranian missiles will make Israel a total basket case.
Mm-hmm.
I think the United States can choose to fight on if we want to fight on. But for us, it would have to be a long process.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're going to be successful in attacking Iran, or anywhere near successful even, we would have to finally attack with ground forces. And our current army is much too small to do that. And the air strength we have is not sufficient, to reply to the hypersonic missiles, of Iran. So before we would be competitive in any long war with Iran, we would have to prepare. We're probably looking 2 or 3 years of preparation, and devotion to the idea, of defeating Iran. And I don't see why we would have the motivation to do that. If you compare this to the World War II situation, our relations with Europe were at stake in that particular situation, and we were very oriented towards Europe for all kinds of reasons. And also there was the ideological battle of, democracy and fascism, motivating us, at that time. I don't see any. I don't see the same kind of ideological motivation, that would be, motivating us to fight a long war in terms of Iran. I know that our press and media can manufacture a lot of hatred, of Iran, but on what basis? They're not a very aggressive power. They don't threaten, the United States directly. In fighting them, we're in the aggressive mode. It's not, them being, in the aggressive mode. So I don't know that we would have the public opinion to sustain a long war, with Iran, that we would have to prepare to fight. In a situation, we'd have to reorient, our economy, and devote much more of the economy to mobilization for war. We'd have to do a lot more defense spending, even than we're doing now. We can afford it all. But the question is, where is the motivation to do it? In other words, it's not like the historic struggle between democracy and fascism. There's not, that kind of motivation to do it. And there's no president behind a war like that who was popular enough to sustain it. In the Second World War, there was Roosevelt, who at the beginning of the war was like a god to many people here in the United States because of, his role in, saving us from the Depression. But we don't have the same kind of situation now. We have a president who is held in contempt by very large parts of the population, who's trying to set up a dictatorship which would sap support, for the regime, in any war with Iran. I just don't see that we could sustain a long war with Iran ourselves. And to win such a war, like I say, it would be a 2, 3, 4 year endeavor. And meanwhile, our strength and our economy would be sapped, and we wouldn't be able to meet the challenges of the BRICs nations, at all. So I just don't see it. I see the Iranians defeating the Israelis in a very short time.
I see the same.
And then the United States, losing the motivation to continue, a long war with Iran. So there's that. So I guess I don't agree with Chris about that. Anyway, going on, we're almost over with the video.
One can't even rule out, if there is a change at the midterm elections, impeachment and things might come back onto the agenda. Well,
and I agree with that. Impeachment could well come up back on the agenda, but I don't think there would be a chance to complete it unless the sweep for Democrats and independents would be so great that basically the Senate, is, even if the Senate is taken over by Democrats, and independents, and even if they have enough gains to get up to 60 seats or 61 seats so they can overcome a filibuster in order to impeach the president, they need 67 votes inside the Senate. So they're going to have some Republican votes supporting them to convict. They'll be able to impeach, but even if it's a huge victory in the midterms, I don't think they're going to have enough votes to convict, unless, of course, public opinion is so turned against the president that Republican voters want to get rid of him too. Then maybe there would be a chance to actually convict him. But then what's our alternative? The original, the initial alternative is going to be J.D. Vance, who, to all intents and purposes, looks like he would be under the thumb of Peter Thiel and Palantir. He made his money by working for Peter Thiel. He was a creation of Peter Thiel. He got into the Senate because of the monetary support of Peter Thiel. And because he got into the Senate, he became the vice president choice of Trump. So if he becomes the president, I'm sure he would change policies from Trump, because I think he's a lot smarter than Trump. But I don't know whether the change in policies would actually be of benefit to the people. I don't know whether he would go on with the attempts to implement, Project 2025 and create a dictatorship. I think Peter Thiel would be in favor of that. But depending on the results of the midterms, J.D. Vance might not consider that it's practical to try to do that. Anyway, these are some of the questions that present themselves in the event of that kind of change.
You know more about that than I, but it's a dangerous moment, and I think he's right to be concerned about it, because it's from both ends of this. It's the young, and it is the MAGA, who are both, don't want a war, a big war in the Middle East, particularly.
Great, thanks. And I want to thank.
Okay, so that's it. Okay, I think you'll agree that video was very, very important, because of the thoroughness of the analysis by Alistair Crook. It was really a thorough analysis with lots of new information about it, explaining how the attack on Iran happened, treating the issues of how Iran might respond, of how long it, might take Israel to attack again, and the reasons for that, how all this, related to American politics even. It just covered a very, very wide range, of issues. But there were good questions by Chris, of course, but this was mostly a situation where the star, was Alistair Crook. His knowledge of so many things is so wide ranging and so detailed. It's very, very exceptional. So we now have covered about half of what we intended to cover for tonight, and it's already time to call it a night.
Yes, it is.
So I'm going to call it a night, but what I'll say is that I'll be back on Tuesday with a discussion of the BRICs understanding of the Israeli, and U.S. war, on Iran. And that will be very interesting because it will cover at least 2 videos with Pepe Escobar. They are, however, far shorter. They're each about I think they're each about between 20 and 25 minutes to cover. So there'll be a lot more than they in the show on Tuesday night. But we will cover these things, and I expect by then there may be more news about what happened, on BRICs. And we'll probably just talk about that on Tuesday night if there are no serious attacks elsewhere. But there may be more significant news with respect to the collapse of Ukraine in just the next few days, because the Russian attacks on Ukraine right now are absolutely blistering. And I think the front is in danger of collapse just about any time. Let's check in once more with your comments before we go tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Evelina says, I read Israel was bombing Damascus. Yeah, Israel bombs whoever it wants to bomb in those areas. So the Kurds were involved in the attacks on Iran. Yes, absolutely, they were involved. Okay, but it wasn't the Kurds in general. It was the MEK. Okay, that Kurdish insurgency group, which has been attacking the enemies of Kurds, all across the arc of Kurdistan. I don't think they represent comprehensive attack by the Kurds on Iran. Mr. Wonderful says that Joseph Firestone, Surrounding Democracy, another great show. I'll be promoting this show on Twitter, following it, so I think that there'll be a lot more action, about the show in the coming days. I hope you will look out for that. I hope you'll all come back on Tuesday and be prepared for another great show at that point. Anyway, thank you, Dee, for coming and for supporting the show.
Yes, thank you for a great show, and spending the time too to go into detail. It was very important, especially certain things, when we're talking about the money issue.
Yeah, the money issue was very important, and the fact that so many of the good analysts from an international politics standpoint are very, very exercised over the money issue, and the problem of the debt, and they, seriously underestimate the capacity of the United States to handle that problem if we want to do it, and if the executive looks around for the right information about it. The debt problems can easily be handled. That's not a serious weakness for the United States.
Mhm.
It can become one if the politics of it, gets really idiotic. And we have a lot of people who are idiots about it. But if they get some of the MMTers in there for advice, they'll be able to solve the debt problems in a few days.
Yes.
Not really a serious problem. And I'm not even talking about getting myself in there.
Right, but they really need to be educated.
Yeah, they really need to be educated, but I think there's a problem with some of the MMTers. They're very focused on getting the decision makers to really understand that the debt inherently is no problem, so that we could go on just with issuing debt forever, okay, if we wanted to. And I think the MMTers are right about that from an economic point of view, but from the point of view of what is politically desirable to do, or what is practical to do politically in a short time, the most important thing is to demonstrate to people that the debt is no problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that means using either platinum coins or overt congressional financing to reduce the debt inside of 6 months to a year by a significant amount, so that everybody can see that it's no problem. And then we end, terrorism about the debt forever, and we end justifications for austerity, which the right wing is using to harass people and to cut the social safety net programs. Sometimes I think the MMTers are too concerned about conveying a true understanding of what is going on, as opposed to getting people to solve the problem in a practical way that would remove the power of the terrorists about the debt to push austerity programs. Anyway, that's what I have to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, sounds good. And, so it was a very good show, going into details, and then the issue with Iran, and the West just doesn't get it. And we'll see how things move along.
I think they're going to move along in a good way for the BRICS nations. I think there might be some struggling, there might be some damage, there might be some war, that's not really necessary. Okay, but I think in the medium term, it's going to work out very well for Iran and for Russia and China and the BRICS nations. We haven't even had a chance here to cover the military aspects of things, but delivering the J-10C planes to Iran from China, it looks like that's going to happen. That's going to be very relevant, because that can happen within the next 2 months before the Israelis attack again. And that's going to shift, the balance of power. And meanwhile, S-400 systems can come from China and from Russia also, and can really shore up the air defenses of Iran, which could mean a big failure for the next Israeli attack, just from a defensive point of view, not even mentioning, the retaliation by Iran and the damage that can do to Israel. Oh, Dawn Foster says, yes, you inform us about geopolitics better than the news organizers that are currently covering anything but what is really happening. Thank you, Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I'm now embedded in an ecology of geopoliticians who are having great streams all the time. And my main job is to absorb those streams and to try to synthesize the thinking in some way. Anyway, Thanks very much, everybody. And good night. And good night.
Good night. Good night, Bonnie.
Good night. Great show.
Yes, I thought so too. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Good night. And let me.
Okay. See you Tuesday.
Yes. See you Tuesday. Enjoy your nights off.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, I gotta figure out how to get out of here now. For some reason, I don't see the button. Let me scroll down. Huh.